Thank you, everyone. My name is Sarah, for those of you that I haven't met before. Today I'm going to talk to you about speleothem sampling methods for paleoclimate research. Don't worry if those terms are not familiar, we will definitely get to them. But the first thing I want to ask you, this is a picture of a cave. You've been sitting here for more than an hour. I want to turn the question around to you and say, okay, what is the value of a cave? What is the value of these pretty things called speleothems in this cave? Is anyone willing to tackle that? One-word answers are fine. By all means. You don't want to hear from me.
Research.
Okay, yes, they have, absolutely, they do have research value. What are some other values of caves? They're pretty, great. Aesthetic value, yeah. What are some other values?
Local economy, people like to go visit.
Absolutely, ecotourism, if you will. Yeah, absolutely. Other values, anything?
Habitat things.
Habitat, yeah. There's some places, for instance, in Karchner, which is being studied here, where you have stalagmites that are here and here that have completely different microbial communities, which is pretty cool. And of course, habitat also for bats and for things using the caves. Any other ideas? That was a great list, yeah. So a lot of varied values in terms of education, in terms of science, in terms of aesthetics, and in terms of the habitat, all of that. One particular value that we're going to talk about is that cave formations, in this case this is a stalagmite, tend to have really good information about past climates or paleoclimate. A stalagmite like this, for instance, could be 3,000 or 4,000 years old. It will have some characteristic trace in it through oxygen and carbon isotopes or trace elements that will tell you something about past climates. However, to do this kind of science, you generally speaking take the stalagmite out of the cave, you bring it to your lab, you cut it down the middle, and you sample down the center where the signal of climate is generally the strongest or the most relevant, related to the actual climate. What's interesting about this is that almost all other cave values don't require actually removing something from the cave or destroying it. And in fact, legally speaking, it's against the law in the U.S. to remove something from a federally protected cave. So there's starting to be, as you can imagine, maybe a little bit of a conflict here. I brought this up to the guy who literally wrote the book on speleothem science. It's called Speleothem Science by Ian Fairchild and Andy Baker. And he said to me, you know, the conservation issues, yeah, they do tend to be discussed at each meeting, and then nothing is done as a community. Okay, so coming from this, from my perspective, just to bring in a bit of the personal story, wow, those colors are interesting. I've been a caver since I was a kid. This is me in Carlsbad when I was about 8, 9, and that's my brother and me in a cave on a restoration project when we were in high school. And for me, coming at this, you know, I grew up with the ethic of you don't take anything out of the cave ever except for photographs. And so I came and I got really excited to work on this cave project, but I started to get this kind of internal conflict for this. And so at that point, I was incredibly happy that Heck and Julie approached me and said, why don't you study that? So with that in mind, I developed this study. It has 2 parts. The first part is a survey of paleoclimate scientists. I asked them 3 questions, namely, how do you pick a cave to work in? How do you pick a speleothem within that cave? And then, what is your method that you're using to sample? I also sort of snuck in the is this your ideal method or not question, which was very interesting. The second survey is, I'm going to call that the other cave stakeholder survey, although of course I recognize that we're all stakeholders in this, including future generations who I can't survey. So the other cave stakeholder survey consists of people like cave managers, owners, other scientists who are not paleoclimate scientists, recreational cavers. It talked about basically I took the methods from this survey and then turned them around to a survey of other stakeholders. It also started to touch on cave values, but not in such a way that I required IRB approval. So that was a good thing. Okay, I checked on that, believe me. And I should say, actually, I received a huge amount of help from Allison Meadow in designing these surveys and then also in piloting them with some of my caver friends here in Arizona. Okay, so of course you have to contact people to get surveys back from them. I basically just did a lit search, and everyone who published on speleothems in the last 5 to 10 years got contacted, which was kind of scary. And so I contacted 79 labs. I got 61 responses, and what surprised me was that most people were actually really enthusiastic. Some people were actually vehemently opposed to anyone even asking about their methods, and they told me I should look at the literature because everyone publishes on how they pick speleothems. They don't, I checked. So that was very interesting. But that said, I got 45 people to fill out the survey. And that was, if you'll notice, that's actually a really good survey response rate. It was very exciting. So like I said, I asked, and then one more thing, the people who answered the survey came from 19 different countries, which is pretty exciting. So, like I said, I asked a number of different questions of this group. I can only tell you about one. The original version of this talk was 48 minutes long, and I bet you're all hungry. So I'm going to talk about just the specific methods. But if you're interested, come talk to me. And actually, I should pass this out. These are just a couple of, I printed up basically, and please don't ask a question about how many trees were harmed in this presentation, because a lot. But this is totally a draft, but please do feel free to pass this around. You can sort of skim through some of the answers that the Speleothem scientists gave me, and then don't skip ahead, but the other stuff in the back is also from the stakeholders. So you can just take a gander at that, hopefully not too disruptively to your neighbors. And there's only a couple, so please do kind of spread them out and pass them around, and give them back because they're drafts. Okay, so the one question I would like to talk about is method. So these are the methods currently in use in the Speleothem paleoclimate community. And there were a lot more sub-details in here in terms of removal. People said, well, I use a chisel and a hammer, or I drill into the base, or I kick it over, that kind of thing. There are a lot of subcategories there, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to talk about it as removal. Down here is percent. So 100% of scientists have used or are considering using complete removal from the cave permanently for their science. About 20% of people replied and said, I've been hearing about this thing called coring. I don't really know how that works, or I've tried it. It was okay. Maybe I'm thinking about using it in the future with better technique, that kind of thing. There was a group of people who said this is kind of the temporary removal category, where you remove from the cave, do your sampling, try and piece it back together, or build a replica, and then put it back in the cave. And then a very small percentage, about 4%, said that they had considered archiving either for themselves in their lab or on a larger scale for other scientists to use. Okay. And then like I told you about that question I snuck in there, right? More than 1/3 of scientists aren't using their ideal method. So people are actually really frustrated with the way that this sampling is done. This is just one example of a quote, but I'm not happy with the brutal methods I usually use, but I have a few options. So there's clearly an issue here. In terms of overall conclusions from the part one of the survey, removal seems the most straightforward approach. Conservation awareness is definitely there, but there's no time, incentive, or funding to do anything differently. To me, this is starting to sound like a commons problem. And clearly to solve this, we need to start talking across that science stakeholder gap. Okay, so that's what we did. Our second survey is for managers, agencies, caterers, all that. I had 110 completed surveys, which was actually more than I expected. This was a Qualtrics survey that I just blasted out to every single cave society that I'm a member of or know someone in. I did have represents a 40% completion rate. I had about 300 people actually start the survey, but then there was kind of a high dropout rate. So who are the actual stakeholders? Who are we even talking about here? Holy cow, that map looks terrible. I'm sorry, you guys must have your red bulb must be both broken. These are all supposed to be red dots. Anyway, this is the U.S. So you can see that there's actually fairly broad representation across the entire United States from 27 different states, concentrated in places that I've lived, like here and here, and then with friends that I have over in the D.C. area. So that might be not totally representative, but it does have a pretty broad scale across the U.S. I also had responses from 8 different countries, which is pretty exciting. And this is, once again, for the stakeholder survey, although, of course, most were from the U.S. The respondents were 70% male and average age of 49. You may start to think, wow, that's a biased sample, but in fact, the last cave trip that I was on in Arizona, I was the only woman out of 12 people, so I'm probably overrepresenting women cavers in this. And the age is actually probably pretty appropriate, too, for the average caver age. In terms of agencies, I had people take the survey from the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, State County Parks, also some from Parks Canada. So these are a lot of entities that are involved in cave management in the western United States particularly. In the eastern United States, a lot of caves are privately owned and managed by cave conservancies. And these are various societies that cavers are often a part of. Groups, people that are parts of those societies tend to be a little bit more engaged in things like the conservation. And then, like I said, I asked people, how do you relate to a cave? Mostly recreational cavers, project cavers, so they go mapping, they go exploring, that kind of thing. Cave rescue specialists and cave managers were the folks taking the survey. So I'm going to remind you back the question that you all answered at the beginning of the talk. What do stakeholders value about Speleothems? I thought about doing this quantitatively in my paper. I did do this quantitatively, but this is a talk and it's more interesting to be semi-quantitative. So I used a word cloud. So I put all of the responses to what is the value of a Speleothem into one of those word cloud generators. So the size of the word actually relates to how often it was mentioned. So right away, the words that pop out at you are things like beauty, things like environment, beautiful, aesthetics, that kind of thing. But you also see almost just as big things like scientific. People talk about paleoclimate. They love the feel, unique. There's lots of different words in here that sort of represent the approach of people to the survey. So just to kind of explore that a little bit more, I thought it would be helpful to share some of the quotes from the second survey, just because very often there's a feeling that the stakeholder community is antagonistic to scientists. So I just wanted to cover this for a second. Okay, so there were definitely some responses that people were pretty grumpy. Removal method is irrelevant. If it's removed, it's gone forever from the cave. And a few more that were more vehement than that. But there were also people who really engaged in this issue and said, if you're going to do it, make this show. Do it in tourist caves and show us why it's being done. People started to creatively think of solutions. There could be something like wetlands mitigation. For every speleothem that is damaged or destroyed, a certain amount has to be permanently protected. It would have to be part of the budget. And then some people, they had read through the survey. Some of these questions are from later in the survey, and they said, yeah, any methods for prior assessment. That sounds like a really good idea. Archival storage also sounds like a great idea. Okay, so let's get to what they actually said on the methods themselves. So coring, generally speaking, once again, there were some subcategories that were suggested. I asked them to say whether or not they agreed or disagreed with the method, with the use of this method. So anything above a 3 is, yeah, we agree with this. Anything below a 3 is not. And I only put in the top 5. I figured it wasn't, we shouldn't just spend a lot of time talking about all 20 options. So coring, generally speaking, permanent removal is fine if it's broken or vandalized. Temporary removal and repairing and replacing. Permanent removal after pre-screening, so that's like measuring what the cave climate is like ahead of time. And then permanent removal and archival. So you probably don't remember a few slides ago, so I'll just compare these two together. So in what should be a beautiful graph of brown and red, but is clearly gray and gray, the stakeholders, I don't know if there's any way to show, yeah, okay. That's fine. I should have chosen 2 more contrasting colors than red and brown. So the stakeholders are these bars here on the sort of the upper bar for each one, and then the scientist's method used or favored is the lower bar for each one. And if you remember permanent removal, 100% of scientists had used or were considering that. So what you can start to see right away is that the pattern of methods that are preferred from the stakeholder side of the issue is pretty different from that of the scientists. So that's where we are right now. This is starting to bring to mind a really famous quote that I like. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking when we created them. The answer for some of these issues will not spontaneously arise from within the scientist community without actually interacting with cave managers and other stakeholders who are actually really deeply embedded in how to work in cave systems. So the subtitle of my ridiculously long talk title was Cultivating a Climate of Cave Conservation Awareness. But I realized that's not really the right framing, right? The real framing is how do we cultivate cave conservation practice in speleothem sampling? And that's really where things start to get kind of sticky. Now you'll forgive my terrible graphic making, but what I sort of feel like right now is pretty typical. Scientists, funding agencies are talking to each other. Scientists are talking to managers in the context of we want to work in your cave. We want to do this kind of science. I've had the woman who used to run the whole Forest Service cave and karst management. She approached me at a meeting after I gave a preliminary version of just the scientist part of this. And she said, yeah, I was really uncomfortable. Some scientists came to me and wanted to do this study, and I let them do it, but it made me feel uncomfortable because I didn't like the way that the stuff was taken out of the cave. And then I never saw the data, so I don't even know what the study was about. And so that made me think that, well, the first thing that has to change here is that clearly this has to be a two-way street, right? And then at the same time, you also have to think about that managers, just in general, there has to be better communication all around. What I should say is well, no, I'll go to the next slide. So how are we going to start that? The first piece is that I have written a journal article and I've built this sort of framework, which I also only have a couple of copies of because you have to give them back. But basically it's a 2-page front and back document that on one side has recommendations for scientists that came out of both the scientist survey and the stakeholder survey. And the other side is recommendations for managers, funding agencies, sort of the speleothem paleoclimate scientist community writ large, and the entire cave stakeholder community. So you guys can take a look at that. But please do give them back because it's also a draft. So the idea there is that was coming right out of the survey and was turned around into sort of a framework for use by the entire community. I'm also going to write a feature for the National Speleological Society. That's a publication that reaches 10,000 cave stakeholders, if you will, who are members of the National Speleological Society, and think about other ways to spread it out from there. But then fundamentally, we still aren't building a dialogue, right? That's still not really having people talking to each other. So the plan is, this was originally supposed to be planned for this year for AGU, but my collaborator went on an IODP cruise, so we decided to postpone that, is to run a workshop on archiving. And that will primarily reach stakeholders, primarily reach scientists. I'd also like to run a workshop on let's develop new methods. How do we actually do this with a lot of the cave managers who are at this National Cave and Karst Management Symposium meeting, and that's not for a few more years. But you know, still fundamentally, these two populations are not at the same place. So what I'm thinking about doing now, and I will definitely take suggestions from all of you on this, is asking AGU if we can apply for some funds to get stakeholders to come to that meeting, so we can actually have scientists and stakeholders in the same room to talk about this issue of archiving and how do we really do this well, both for the science side of things as well as for the cave manager side of things. So that's what I'm hopeful to do in the next couple of years. But in the meantime, these pieces will be live hopefully in the next year. So I think that is all, and I want to ask if there are any questions.